Hello everyone, this is Benny Hills back with another video in the series of theory videos that I'm making. And this one is about the art of role assessment. So assessing your role in a match is a very important part of formulating a long-term game plan. It's very different from like planning out a turn, like how you want to sequence lands or something, because it's like the overall structure of how you're trying to make the game go. And so at its most fundamental or its most basic level, this is deciding who's the beatdown. So there's a great Mike Flores article about this on MTG TCG player, I think. I don't remember exactly where, but there's a lot of literature about this. But just like at its essence, it's like, is trading 3 damage for 3 damage with its opponent good? We both have a 3/3. Do we want to attack or do we want to hold it back to block? And so the way to answer this question is to basically think, given a normal way for a game to develop, who wins this game if it makes it to turn 20? And so if you're playing mono red and your opponent is playing blue eye control, probably they win at that point because you really have a lot of cards that are good in the early game and like good synergistically when you're trying to like execute a very linear game plan. But their cards are more individually powerful and they pretty much have ways to answer all of your cards, but you have some cards that just cannot, or they have some cards that you just can't really answer effectively. So knowing whether or not you're the beatdown as early as possible is very good because it changes the way you play the matchup a lot. Um, there's a couple ways of determining who is the beatdown. First of all, some decks are just designed to always be the beatdown and can't really do anything else. So this is like a all-in mono red deck that's just trying to win as fast as possible with all one drops. That deck can't really play a control game, and so pretty much every single matchup you try to assume the role of the beatdown, and if you somehow end up getting forced into the control role, you'll probably lose because you're just on the back foot when your deck is very much designed to be attacking proactively. Some decks are always the control deck. This is a little bit less common, but like 98% of the time when I sleeve up blue eye control, I'm assuming that I have the better long game, and my goal is to get there. So you're willing to sort of trade off like do trades that are maybe resource negative for you. Like for example, you could play Teferi Time Raveler and just bounce like a 1-drop and let them kill it. That's pretty much as bad as Teferi could ever be. Like it's not a great tempo swing. You're not like getting a ton of value from it, but it's a totally fine exchange a lot of the times when your main goal is just to like buy time, like draw your card and like make them invest a little bit of mana and just like bridge towards the later game. So in matchups where you know that you're the control deck and you know that you're going to have the advantage in the long game, you don't really need to worry about like squeezing out every ounce of value from your cards because you just naturally have so many like more powerful cards built into your game plan that you don't need to worry about that long game. So this is very different in a situation like a control mirror where you really don't want to just throw away your Teferi to like draw a card. In that situation, like you're on much more even footing. It's not clear who has the advantage in the long game. So that advantage will be determined by who can eke out more incremental value from their cards in small exchanges like this. Combo decks are another sort of deck that know exactly what they want, like what role they're trying to play in the matchup when the matchup starts. And so, I mean, that's a little bit different than who's the beatdown, but in general, they are just trying to execute their game plan. And against combo is where I think control mages are most tested because you can't necessarily fall into your same heuristic of just trying to win the very long game. Like if you're playing against like Ritual Storm with Blue Eye Control in Modern, they'll eventually be able to combo you out. Like they can just play a bunch of rituals, and even if you have your counter spells lined up, they can just grave shot you out of the game. So you actually have to sort of adopt some parts of an aggressive game plan, even though like normally you're a control deck. So when you're playing against combo, it's a lot more common that you want to do things like just play turn 2 Snapcaster Mage as a beater. This is also true against things like Tron, where like you can sometimes establish a long game that you can win, but a lot of the times they will just eventually beat you down, even if you're cutting them off of mana. So you need to be attacking them and lowering their life total rather than just like going for the long game. This isn't always the case. Sometimes you can try to win the long game with a control deck against something like Tron or against combo. And there's sort of two ways to do that. So first of all, you can just try and establish like what I call ultimate control, where you are just drawing so many cards that you can just like deal with their threats that are very hard to answer and like present like a counter spell every single turn for the rest of the game. So the way you do this is ideally with answers that are very flexible, like counter spells that can hit cast triggers off of things like Emrakul the Promised End and Ulamog. And secondly, to be able to have just very, very consistent card draw. So if you have like Teferi and Jace the Mind Sculptor at the same time, Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, you're drawing so many cards per turn that you are going to be able to find a counterspell every single turn. This is a lot easier now that you can loop Cryptic Commands with Mystic Sanctuary, but it's still something to be aware of. Like, you want to get to the point where you can just present a hard counterspell every single turn of the game. The other way to establish sort of long game control is with lock pieces. So if you're playing against something like Tron and you have, like, you've crumbled and dusted their land, so you know they'll never assemble Tron. You've, like, destroyed a bunch of lands, so you know they just, like, don't have the resources in their deck to cast their huge things. So that's another way to do it. I think that's a little bit harder to do, at least in younger formats. Sometimes in Legacy you can just, like, hard lock an opponent with Blood Moon, but it's difficult to do, and so in general, I do advocate for taking the more aggressive approach in these combo matchups and trying to establish a clock, but it's important to be consistent in your game plan. So, Geist of St. Traft puts a very fast clock on opponents. So it's a card I've liked sometimes in the sideboard in modern control decks. But having like one Geist of St. Traft and like the rest of your deck is trying to establish this like hardcore late game control isn't really focused enough. Like, you don't want to be pushing your deck in both directions because that'll just weaken you in both of them. So when you're sideboarding, it's important to consider, am I going to be trying to clock them or just shut them down at every single turn? And so if your plan is to shut them down at every single turn, you want to avoid playing things like creatures that are just not going to answer their threats. And likewise, like, if you are trying to have a fast clock, you want to bring in every single card that can add to that clock and not sort of, you know, dilute your deck with a couple answers that, like, may be good in some circumstances, but, like, your game plan is to put a fast clock on them. And so this is why you see cards like Monastery Mentor be great sideboard options in a variety of different formats, because they let you bring in that pressure. But you don't want to just bring it in every single time, because sometimes you are trying to play a sort of longer, out-controlling game plan. This is a situation where a transformational sideboard can be very helpful. So again, a lot of decks can really only play one role, but most control decks need to be able to do both to some extent. So you can have a sort of semi-transformational sideboard, where maybe you're not completely revamping your entire game plan, but you can bring in like a variety of different threats to really lower your curve and present a much faster clock than you can in game one. And if your opponent isn't prepared for that, they're, you know, ready for slogging through a million counterspells, and you can sort of like cheese a win with a fast clock. Another consideration when you're determining who the beatdown is there's 3 different levels of resources. So there's board resources, hand resources, and deck resources. This is a really important distinction that a lot of people don't fully grasp. And so I want to illustrate this with an example from my blue-white control days. I want to illustrate this with a nice example. So there was a time when blue-white control mirrors really came down to deck resources. And so I found at this point everyone was playing Gideon of the Trials, and the game would inevitably come down to decking. And so the way you won was Gideon emblem and being able to protect that and deal with your opponent's Gideons. So I realized one time we had traded counterspells, traded planeswalkers, we were sort of wearing down each other's resources, and we both had not many cards left in library. And my opponent fired off his Sphinx's Rev for 5 at the end of my turn, and I didn't counter it, even though I could have, because it sort of goes against every bone in your body, right? It's a 5 for 1. You can't come back from that. But at a certain point, the most relevant thing is actually resources in library. This isn't true all the time, especially when you can loot Mystic Sanctuaries. This weakens this dynamic a little bit, but it's still relevant a lot of the time, where, like, your opponent has a finite number of win conditions in their deck, and if you have a lot of answers, you can run them out of answers. So at that point, you want to just ignore all their card draw, ignore their card advantage, just only worry about the cards that are actually killing you, because you can have a very real chance of milling them. This has come up a lot for me in Pioneer when I'm playing blue-white control versus Niv-Mizzet decks, because you can sort of run them out of all 4 of their Niv-Mizzets via like a couple Supreme Verdicts, Elspeth Conquers Death, things like that, maybe one counterspell. And then, like, you know, after their Niv-Mizzets, they have more win conditions, but like if you can deal with their Uros, then, you know, you can definitely run them out of ways to win the game. And so that can become a situation where you just don't even worry about cards that are drawn cards, and you only worry about resources in library. Now, one step below this is resources in hand. So this is the axis that Jund fights on. Like, you don't really worry about what cards they have in their library, but you worry about their hand and try and sort of dismantle their hand and their board. And like out of all the cards that are currently like in play via like either hand or like on the battlefield, sort of diminishing their resources there and beating those cards. And so this is the second axis of like broad resource analysis, just determining like, okay, I can't beat them before they play their hand, and I'm not going to worry about all the cards in their deck, but I'm going to try and beat all the cards they have access to right now. And then the third sort of lowest level of resources is just board. And so the most classic example of this is like all out burn, where like you're playing Goblin Guide, you're hitting them, you're letting them get lands into their hand, but you don't even care because your plan is to just kill them before they can use the cards in their hand. So when you're worried about this level of resources, you're just trying to be as fast as possible. You only care about the cards that are on the board. So you don't care about hypothetical card disadvantage or anything like that. You know, you can path to exile their thing and you don't care that they get the land because you're just going for the kill. So when you're trying to pressure them on this axis, this is where bounce spells become really good. They're sort of, you know, they're card disadvantage in the abstract, but they're very tempo positive. And you can play to the board very well. And, you know, in the situation where you're clearly the beatdown, you're trying to win before, like, your role is to win before they can take advantage of their superior cards in hand and in library. So when you're assessing your role, think about these three different factors. Whether you can, like, win before their hand matters, and in which case you only care about the board, or if they'll be able to play their whole hand, and so you need to worry about their hand, but you're trying to win before their deck matters, or if you're playing a very, very long game where the most relevant thing is number of resources in deck. And so now, even if it's a matchup where resources in deck can matter, the way Magic has been designed in recent years, you know, you can say this is good or bad, but it is more snowbally. So there's going to be a lot of games where, like, one player just snowballs a massive advantage, and it looks like a blowout by the end of the game. And in that situation, resources in deck don't really matter because, like, you can just line up every single exchange to favor you, and you can just win easily. So you definitely want to make sure you're not too prioritizing resources in deck and you're just like losing to the board and you're sort of approaching a board state where you're just too far behind and you can't come back. But keeping in mind that you can't let them snowball too much, it's good to think about resources in deck and how you can, you know, use that consideration to your advantage. So in conclusion, when you're assessing your role in a matchup, first of all, you need to think about who has inevitability, who will win if the game goes very, very long. This depends on a lot of factors, but one of the biggest ones is who has cards that the other player cannot answer. So, you know, who has that like trump card that you just can't beat. And when you've determined what your role is in the matchup, you need to really dive into that role. You don't want to sort of tread the line. You want to go all in on that new game plan. So, you know, if your opponent has multiple Dark Confidants and you're transitioning to the plan of just trying to lower their life total, like, immediately hit with Colonnade every chance you get. And, like, you know, flash in Snapcaster to hit for 2 when you get the chance. And never, ever kill their Dark Confidants. You really don't want to waver between rolls and be like, oh, I'll let them take a few hits, but then I'll kill the Dark Confidants. Because at that point, you have a very unfocused game plan. They've already accumulated card advantage from the Dark Confidants, and now you're just, like, helping them to address the weakness, which is, you know, the decreasing life total. So when you do find your lane and your avenue to victory, you want to go all in on that usually. I mean, sometimes you should keep an open mind and be willing to like transition roles multiple times in the game, but it's rare that works. In general, you need to sort of, you don't need to start the game on turn 1 with your role in mind always, but you need to identify which role gives you the most likely possible victory and just go all in on that and take lines that give you outs to winning in that manner. Finally, you need to think about which axis you're going to be pressuring their resources on, whether it's just thinking about the board, thinking about the hand, you know, their top 2 cards in their library, or their entire deck, and make decisions accordingly when it comes to resource trades. I mean, a perfect example of this is if you're playing Field Ruin and Spreading Seas in a blue-white control deck in Modern, you can run them out of red sources in their deck if your opponent is playing Jund Death's Shadow or Grixis Shadow. And so in that situation, like, yeah, maybe Watergrave is their best land, but like, just all from the beginning of the game, be thinking about cutting them off all of their red lands in their deck. And you can just do that because, you know, they often have 3 red lands in their deck or something like that. So that's just very, very easy to cut them off of. And in that situation, you want to save your Spreading Seas for their basics because you know your Field Ruin can hit their other lands. So that's some thoughts on role assessment. It's a really important part of the game, and it's very important both to have a sense of what your role generally will be when you're making mulligan decisions, and also be open-minded to switching roles during the match. But know that when you do have a role, you want to commit to that role and not sort of back off when you have a possible window. It's important to identify your role when you're making mulligan decisions more than any other point, because some sort of fast linear combo decks are basically planning on winning just with their 7 cards. Like, you don't really want to keep a hand that can't do anything and is relying on top decks, because your opponent can sort of dismantle you or assemble their game plan and you don't have much interaction. So, like, if you're playing something like Neoform Combo, you want to find a hand that can just win with the cards in your opener. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're playing Blue-White Control, you're trying to hit land drops and win the very late game. So, a hand that has like 5 lands, Spreading Seas, Cryptic Command on the play, it's a good hand because you don't know like exactly what answers you need, but you know that you have inevitability. So you don't need to get off to that explosive start. You can win by going to the long game. And so you just want to be hitting land drops and hopefully not falling too far behind, rather than like worrying about establishing that clock, because you don't have inevitability. So your window of winning is very narrow. There's a lot of decks that really can't win when the game gets past turn 6. And so those decks need to mulligan much more aggressively. But if you're playing a deck that's not trying to do that and is just trying to go towards the long game, then you can afford to keep sort of looser, more speculative hands with the assumption that your top decks will, and your card draw that you have in your deck will let you find your answers, and you can fall a bit behind, but then you'll have ways to catch up in your deck. So thank you for watching. Let me know if you think there's anything that I'm really misinterpreting or forgetting about, and also definitely let me know for the 3rd installment of this series what sort of theory videos you would like me to post. So this could be about specific cards, sort of general theory like role assessment. I could do format specific things like metagame breakdowns, although I don't know the metagame in all formats equally well, of course. Like, if you ask me about the Penny Dreadful metagame, like, I can play a deck and maybe have some success with it, but I will have no idea how to like analyze different matchups from multiple angles, since I just haven't played that format that much. So again, thank you so much for watching. Please comment what you'd like me to do in the future, and see you next time.